Louis de Clameren, the second son of the Marquis, was one of those self-controlled men who, beneath a cool, careless manner, conceal a fiery temperament and ungovernable passions. All sorts of extravagant ideas had begun to ferment in his disordered brain, long before the occurrence which decided the destiny of the Clameren family. Apparently occupied in the pursuit of pleasure, this precocious hypocrite longed for a larger field in which to indulge his evil inclinations, secretly cursing the stern necessity which chained him down to this dreary country life, and the old chateau, which to him was more gloomy than a prison, and as lifeless as the grave. This existence, dragged out in the country and the small neighboring towns, was too monotonous for his restless nature. The paternal authority, though so gently expressed, exasperated his rebellious temper. He thirsted for independence, riches, excitement, and all the unknown pleasures that pall upon the senses simultaneously with their attainment. Louis did not love his father, and he hated his brother Gaston. The old Marquis, in his culpable thoughtlessness, had kindled this burning envy in the heart of his second son. A strict observer of traditional rights, he had always declared that the eldest son of a noble house should inherit all the family possessions, and that he intended to leave Gaston his entire fortune. This flagrant injustice and favoritism inspired Louis with envious hatred for his brother. Gaston always said that he would never consent to profit by this paternal partiality, but would share equally with his brother. Judging others by himself, Louis placed no faith in this assertion, which he called an ostentatious affectation of generosity. Although this hatred was unsuspected by the Marquis and Gaston, it was betrayed by acts significant enough to attract the attention of the servants, who often commented upon it. They were so fully aware of Louis's sentiments toward his brother that, when he was prevented from escaping because of the stumbling horse, they refused to believe it an accident, and, whenever Louis came near, would mutter, "Fratricide." A deplorable scene took place between Louis and Saint Jean, who was allowed, on account of his 50 years' faithful service, to take liberties which he sometimes abused by making rough speeches to his superiors. "It is a great pity," said the old servant, "that a skillful rider like yourself should have fallen at the very moment when your brother's life depended upon your horsemanship." At this broad insinuation, Louis turned pale, and threateningly cried out, "You insolent dog, what do you mean?" "You know well enough what I mean, monsieur," the old man said, significantly. "I do not know. Explain your impertinence, speak, I tell you." The man only answered by a meaning look, which so incensed Louis that he rushed toward him with upraised whip, and would have beaten him unmercifully had not the other servants interfered, and dragged Saint Jean from the spot. This altercation occurred while Gaston was in the madder field trying to escape his pursuers. After a while the gendarmes and hussars returned, with slow tread and sad faces, to say that Gaston de Clameren had plunged into the Rhône, and was instantly drowned. This melancholy news was received with groans and tears by everyone save Louis, who remained calm and unmoved. Not a single muscle of his face quivered. But his eyes sparkled with triumph. A secret voice cried within him, "Now you are assured of the family fortune, and a marquis's coronet." He was no longer the poverty-stricken younger son, but the sole heir of the Clamerens. The corporal of the gendarmes had said, "I would not be the one to tell the poor old man that his son is drowned." Louis felt none of the tender-hearted scruples of the brave old soldier. He instantly went to his father's sick-room, and said, in a firm voice, "My brother had to choose between disgrace and death, he is dead." Like a sturdy oak stricken by lightning, the Marquis tottered and fell when these fatal words sounded in his ears. The doctors soon arrived, but alas! only to say that science was of no avail. Toward daybreak, Louis, without a tear, received his father's last sigh. Louis was now the master. All the unjust precautions taken by the Marquis to elude the law, and ensure beyond dispute the possession of his entire fortune to his eldest son, turned against him. By means of a fraudulent deed of trust drawn by his dishonest lawyer, M. de Clameren had disposed everything so that, on the day of his death, every farthing he owned would be Gaston's. Louis alone was benefited by this precaution. He came into possession without even being called upon for the certificate of his brother's death. He was now Marquis of Clameren, he was free, he was comparatively rich. He who had never had 25 crowns in his pocket at once, now found himself the possessor of 200,000 francs. This sudden, unexpected fortune so completely turned his head that he forgot his skillful dissimulation. His demeanor at the funeral of the Marquis was much censured. He followed the coffin, with his head bowed and his face buried in a handkerchief, but this did not conceal the buoyancy of his spirit, and the joy which sparkled in his eyes. The day after the funeral, Louis sold everything that he could dispose of, horses, carriages, and family plate. The next day he discharged all the old servants, who had hoped to end their days beneath the hospitable roof of Clameren. Several, with tears in their eyes, took him aside, and entreated him to let them stay without wages. He roughly ordered them to be gone, and never appear before his eyes again. He sent for his father's lawyer, and gave him a power of attorney to sell the estate, and received in return the sum of 20,000 francs as the first payment in advance. At the close of the week, he locked up the chateau, with a vow never to cross its sill again, and left the keys in the keeping of Saint Jean, who owned a little house near Clameren, and would continue to live in the neighborhood. Poor Saint Jean! Little did he think that, in preventing Valentine from seeing Louis, he had ruined the prospects of his beloved Gaston. On receiving the keys, he asked one question. "Shall we not search for your brother's body, Emma the Marquis?" he inquired in broken-hearted tones. "And, if it is found, what must be done with it?" "I shall leave instructions with my notary," replied Louis. And he hurried away from Clameren as if the ground burnt his feet. He went to Tarascon, where he had already forwarded his baggage, and took the stagecoach which traveled between Marseilles and Paris, the railroad not yet being finished. At last he was off. The lumbering old stage rattled along, drawn by 6 horses, and the deep gullies made by the wheels seemed so many abysses between the past and the future. Lying back in a corner of the stage, Louis de Clameren enjoyed in anticipation the fields of pleasure spread before his dazzled eyes. At the end of the journey, Paris rose up before him, radiant, brilliantly dazzling as the sun. Yes, he was going to Paris, the promised land, the city of wonders, where every Aladdin finds a lamp. There all ambitions are crowned, all dreams realized, all passions, all desires, good and evil, can be satisfied. There the fast-fleeting days are followed by nights of ever-varied pleasure and excitement. In 20 theaters tragedy weeps, or comedy laughs, whilst at the opera the most beautiful women in the world, sparkling with diamonds, are ready to die with ecstasy at the sound of divine music, everywhere noise, excitement, luxury, and pleasure. What a dream! The heart of Louis de Clameren was swollen with desire, and he felt that he should go mad if the horses crawled with such torturing slowness. He would like to spring from the old stage, and fly to his haven of delight. He never once thought of the past with a pang of regret. What mattered it to him how his father and brother had died? All his energies were devoted to penetrating the mysterious future that now awaited him. Was not every chance in his favor? He was young, rich, handsome, and a marquis. He had a constitution of iron, he carried 20,000 francs in his pocket, and would soon have 10 times as many more. He, who had always been poor, regarded this sum as an exhaustless treasure. And at nightfall, when he jumped from the stage upon the brilliantly lighted street of Paris, he seemed to be taking possession of the grand city, and felt as though he could buy everything in it. His illusions were those natural to all young men who suddenly come into possession of a patrimony after years of privation. It is this ignorance of the real value of money that squanders fortunes, and fritters away accumulated patrimony so laboriously earned and saved in the frugal provinces. Imbued with his own importance, accustomed to the deference of the country people, the young Marquis came to Paris with the expectation of being a lion, supposing that his name and fortune were sufficient to place him upon any pinnacle he might desire. He was mortified to discover his error. To his great surprise, he discovered that he possessed nothing which constituted a position in this immense city. He found that in the midst of this busy, indifferent crowd, he was lost, as unnoticed as a drop of water in a torrent. But this unflattering reality could not discourage a man who was determined to gratify his passion at all costs. His ancestral name gained him but one privilege, disastrous for his future: it opened to him the doors of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. There he became intimate with men of his own age and rank, whose incomes were larger than his principal. Nearly all of them confessed that they only kept up their extravagant style of living by dint of skillful economy behind the scenes, and by regulating their vices and follies as judiciously as a hosier would manage his Sunday holidays. This information astonished Louis, but did not open his eyes. He endeavored to imitate the dashing style of these economically wasteful young men, without pretending to conform to their prudential rules. He learned how to spend, but not how to settle his accounts as they did. He was Marquis of Clamorin, and, having given himself a reputation of great wealth, he was welcomed by the elite of society. If he made no friends, he had at least many acquaintances. Among the set into which he was received immediately upon his arrival, he found 10 satellites who took pleasure in initiating him into the secrets of fashionable life, and correcting any little provincialisms betrayed in his manners and conversation. He profited well and quickly by their lessons. At the end of 3 months he was fairly launched. His reputation as a skillful gambler and one of the fastest men in Paris was fully established. He had rented handsome apartments, with a coach-house and stable for 3 horses. Although he only furnished this bachelor's establishment with what was necessary and comfortable, he found that comforts were very costly in this instance. So that the day he took possession of his apartments, and looked over his bills, he made the startling discovery that this short apprenticeship of Paris had cost him 50,000 francs, 1/4 of his fortune. Still he clung to his brilliant friends, although in a state of inferiority which was mortifying to his vanity, like a poor squire straining every nerve to make his nag keep up with blooded horses in a race. 50,000 francs. For a moment Louis had a faint idea of retreating from the scene of temptation. But what a fall! Besides, his vices bloomed and flourished in this charming center. He had heretofore considered himself fast, but the past was a state of unsophisticated verdancy, compared with the 1,000 attractive sins in which he now indulged. Then the sight of suddenly acquired fortunes, and the many examples of the successful results of hazardous ventures, inflamed his mind, and persuaded him to try his fortune in the game of speculation. He thought that in this great, rich city, he certainly could succeed in seizing a share of the loaves and fishes. But how? He had no idea, and he did not seek to find one. He imagined that his good fortune would some day come, and that all he had to do was to wait for it. This is one of the errors which it is time to destroy. Fortune is not to be wasted upon idle fools. In this furious race of self-interest, it requires great skill to bestride the capricious mare called opportunity, and make her lead to the end in view. Every winner must possess a strong will and a dexterous hand. But Louis did not devote much thought to the matter. Like the foolish man who wished to draw the prize without contributing to the raffle, he thought. Bast. Opportunity, chance, a rich marriage will put me all right again. The rich bride failed to appear, and his last Louis had gone the way of its predecessors. To a pressing demand for money, his notary replied by a refusal. Your lands are all gone, he wrote, you now possess nothing but the chateau. It is very valuable, but it is difficult, if not impossible, to find a purchaser of so large an amount of real estate, in its present condition. I will use every effort to make a good sale, and if successful, will inform you of the fact immediately. Louis was thunderstruck at this final catastrophe, as much surprised as if he could have expected any other result. But what could he do? Ruined, with nothing to look forward to, the best course was to imitate the large number of poor fools who each year rise up, shine a moment, then suddenly disappear. But Louis could not renounce this life of ease and pleasure which he had been leading for the last 3 years. After leaving his fortune on the battleground, he was willing to leave the shreds of his honor. He first lived on the reputation of his dissipated fortune, on the credit remaining to a man who has spent much in a short space of time. This resource was soon exhausted. The day came when his creditors seized all they could lay their hands upon, the last remains of his opulence, his carriages, horses, and costly furniture. He took refuge in a quiet hotel, but he could not keep away from the wealthy set whom he considered his friends. He lived upon them as he had lived upon the tradesmen who furnished his supplies. Borrowing from 1 Louis up to 25, from anybody who would lend to him, he never pretended to pay them. Constantly betting, no one ever saw him pay a wager. He piloted all the raw young men who fell into his hands, and utilized, in rendering shameful services, an experience which had cost him 200,000 francs. He was half courtier, half adventurer. He was not banished, but was made to cruelly expiate the favor of being tolerated. No one had the least regard for his feelings, or hesitated to tell him to his face what was thought of his unprincipled conduct. Thus, when alone in his little den, he would give way to fits of violent rage. He had not yet reached a state of callousness to be able to endure these humiliations without the keenest torture to his false pride and vanity. Envy and covetousness had long since stifled every sentiment of honor and self-respect in his base heart. For a few years of opulence he was ready to commit any crime. And, though he did not commit a crime, he came very near it, and was the principal in a disgraceful affair of swindling and extortion, which raised such an outcry against him that he was obliged to leave Paris. Count de Commaring, an old friend of his father, hushed up the matter, and furnished him with money to take him to England. And how did he manage to live in London? The detectives of the most corrupt capital in existence were the only people who knew his means of support. Descending to the last stages of vice, the Marquis of Clamorin finally found his level in a society composed of shameless women and gamblers. Compelled to quit London, he traveled over Europe, with no other capital than his knavish audacity, deep depravity, and his skill at cards. Finally, in 1865, he had a run of good luck at Hamburg, and returned to Paris, where he imagined himself entirely forgotten. 18 years had passed since he left Paris. The first step which he took on his return, before even settling himself in Paris, was to make a visit to his old home. Not that he had any relative or friend in that part of the country, from whom he could expect any assistance, but he remembered the old manor, which his notary had been unable to sell. He thought that perhaps by this time a purchaser had appeared, and he determined to go himself and ascertain how much he should receive for this old chateau, which had cost 100,000 francs in the building. On a beautiful October evening he reached Tarascon, and there learned that he was still the owner of the Chateau of Clamaran. The next morning, he set out on foot to visit the paternal home, which he had not seen for 25 years. Everything was so changed that he scarcely recognized this country, where he had been born and passed his youth. Yet the impression was so strong that this man, tried by such varied, strange adventures, for a moment felt like retracing his steps. He only continued his road because a secret, hopeful voice cried in him, "Onward, onward!" As if, at the end of the journey, was to be found a new life and the long-wished-for good fortune. As Louis advanced, the changes appeared less striking. He began to be familiar with the ground. Soon, through the trees, he distinguished the village steeple, then the village itself, built upon the gentle rising of a hill, crowned by a wood of olive trees. He recognized the first houses he saw, the farrier's shed covered with ivy, the old parsonage, and farther on the village tavern, where he and Gaston used to play billiards. In spite of what he called his scorn of vulgar prejudices, he felt a thrill of strange emotion as he looked on these once familiar objects. He could not overcome a feeling of sadness as scenes of the past rose up before him. How many events had occurred since he last walked along this path, and received a friendly bow and smile from every villager. Then life appeared to him like a fairy scene, in which his every wish was gratified. And now, he had returned, dishonored, worn out, disgusted with the realities of life, still tasting the bitter dregs of the cup of shame, stigmatized, poverty-stricken, and friendless, with nothing to lose, and nothing to look forward to. The few villagers whom he met turned and stood gazing after this dust-covered stranger, and wondered who he could be. Upon reaching St. Jean's house, he found the door open. He walked into the immense empty kitchen. He rapped on the table, and was answered by a voice calling out, "Who is there?" The next moment a man of about 40 years appeared in the doorway, and seemed much surprised at finding a stranger standing in his kitchen. "What will you have, monsieur?" he inquired. "Does not Saint Jean, the old valet of the Marquis of Clamaran, live here?" "My father died 5 years ago, monsieur," replied the man in a sad tone. This news affected Louis painfully, as if he had expected this old man to restore him some of his lost youth. The last link was gone. He sighed, and, after a silence, said, "I am the Marquis of Clamaran." The farmer, at these words, uttered an exclamation of joy. He seized Louis's hand, and, pressing it with respectful attention, cried, "You are the Marquis! Alas," he continued, "why is not my poor father alive to see you? He would be so happy." His last words were about his dear masters, and many a time did he sigh and mourn at not receiving any news of you. He is beneath the sod now, resting after a well-spent life, but I, Joseph, his son, am here to take his place, and devote my life to your service. What an honor it is to have you in my house! Ah, my wife will be happy to see you, she has all her life heard of the Clamarans." Here he ran into the garden, and called, "Toinette! I say, Toinette! Come here quickly!" This cordial welcome delighted Louis. So many years had gone by since he had been greeted with an expression of kindness, or felt the pressure of a friendly hand. In a few moments a handsome, dark-eyed young woman entered the room, and stood blushing with confusion at sight of the stranger. "This is my wife, monsieur," said Joseph, leading her toward Louis, "but I have not given her time to put on her finery. This is the Marquis, Antoinette." The farmer's wife bowed, and, having nothing to say, gracefully uplifted her brow, upon which the Marquis pressed a kiss. "You will see the children in a few minutes, the Marquis," said Joseph. "I have sent to the school for them." The worthy couple overwhelmed the Marquis with attentions. After so long a walk he must be hungry, they said. He must take a glass of wine now, and breakfast would soon be ready. They would be so proud and happy if the Marquis would partake of a country breakfast. Louis willingly accepted their invitation, and Joseph went to the cellar after the wine, while Toinette ran to catch her fattest pullet. In a short time, Louis sat down to a table laden with the best of everything on the farm, waited upon by Joseph and his wife, who watched him with respectful interest and awe. The children came running in from school, smeared with the juice of berries. After Louis had embraced them, they stood off in a corner, and gazed at him with eyes wide open, as if he were a rare curiosity. The important news had spread, and a number of villagers and countrymen appeared at the open door, to speak to the Marquis of Clamaran. "I am such a wanting of the Marquis, don't you remember me?" "Ah! I should have recognized you anywhere. The late Marquis was very good to me." Another would say, "Don't you remember the time when you lent me your gun to go hunting?" Louis welcomed with secret delight all these protestations and proofs of devotion which had not chilled with time. The kindly voices of these honest people recalled many pleasant moments of the past, and made him feel once more the fresh sensations of his youth. Here, at least, no echoes of his stormy life had been heard, no suspicions of his shameful career were entertained by these humble villagers on the borders of the Rhône. He, the adventurer, the bully, the base accomplice of London swindlers, delighted in these marks of respect and veneration, bestowed upon him as the representative of the House of Clamaran. It seemed to make him once more feel a little self-respect, as if the future were not utterly hopeless. Ah, had he possessed only a quarter of his squandered inheritance, how happy he would be to peacefully end his days in this his native village. But this rest after so many vain excitements, this haven after so many storms and shipwrecks, was denied him. He was penniless. How could he live here when he had nothing to live upon? This thought of his pressing want gave him courage to ask Joseph for the key of the chateau, that he might go and examine its condition. "You won't need the key, except the one to the front door, of the Marquis," replied Joseph. It was but too true. Time had done its work, and the lordly manor of Clamaran was nothing but a ruin. The rain and sun had rotted the shutters so that they were crumbling and dilapidated. Here and there were traces of the friendly hand of Saint Jean, who had tried to retard the total ruin of the old chateau, but of what use were his efforts? Within, the desolation was still greater. All of the furniture which Louis had not dared to sell stood in the position he left it, but in what a state! All of the tapestry hangings and coverings were moth-eaten and in tatters. Nothing seemed left but the dust-covered woodwork of the chairs and sofas. Louis was almost afraid to enter these grand, gloomy rooms, where every footfall echoed until the air seemed to be filled with sounds strange and ominous. He almost expected to see the angry old Marquis start from some dark corner, and heap curses on his head for having dishonored the name. He turned pale with terror, when he suddenly recalled the scene of his fatal stumble and poor Gaston's death. The room was surely inhabited by the spirits of these two murdered men. His nerves could not bear it, and he hurried out into the open air and sunshine. After a while, he recovered sufficiently to remember the object of his visit. Poor Saint Jean was foolish to let the furniture in the chateau drop to pieces. Why did he not use it? My father would not have dared to touch anything without receiving an order, the Marquis. He was very unwise to wait for an order, when anything was going to destruction without benefiting anyone. As the chateau is fast approaching the condition of the furniture, and my fortune does not permit me to repair it, I will sell it before the walls crumble away. Joseph could scarcely believe his ears. He regarded the selling of the chateau of Clamaran as a sacrilege, but he was not bold of speech, like his father, so he dared not express an opinion. "Would there be difficulty in selling this ruin?" continued Louis. "That depends upon the price you ask, M. the Marquis. I know a man who would purchase the property if he could get it cheap." "Who is he?" "Emile Gaboriau, who lives on the other side of the river. He came from Beaucaire, and 12 years ago married a servant maid of the late Countess de la Verberie. Perhaps M. the Marquis remembers her, a plump, bright-eyed brunette, named Mihan." Louis did not remember Mihan. "When can we see this Gaboriau?" he inquired. "Today. I will engage a boat to take us over." "Well, let us go now. I have no time to lose." An entire generation has passed away since Louis had last crossed the Rhône in old Pillarel's boat. The faithful ferryman had been buried many years, and his duties were now performed by his son, who, possessing great respect for traditional opinions, was delighted at the honor of rowing the Marquis of Clamarin in his boat, and soon had it ready for Louis and Joseph to take their seats. As soon as they were fairly started, Joseph began to warn the Marquis against the wily Gaboriau. "He is a cunning fox," said the farmer. "I have had a bad opinion of him ever since his marriage, which was a shameful affair altogether. Mihan was over 50 years of age, and he was only 24, when he married her, so you may know it was money, and not a wife, that he wanted. She, poor fool, believed that the young scamp really loved her, and gave herself and her money up to him. Women will be trusting fools to the end of time. And Gaboriau is not the man to let money lie idle. He speculated with Mihan's gold, and is now very rich. But she, poor thing, does not profit by his wealth. One can easily understand his not feeling any love for her, when she looks like his grandmother, but he deprives her of the necessaries of life, and beats her cruelly. He would like to plant her 6 feet underground," said the ferryman. "Well, it won't be long before he has the satisfaction of burying her," said Joseph. "The poor old woman has been in almost a dying condition ever since Gaboriau brought a worthless jade to take charge of the house, and makes his wife wait upon her like a servant." When they reached the opposite shore, Joseph asked young Pillarel to await their return. Joseph knocked at the gate of the well-cultivated farm, and inquired for the master. The farm boy said that Emile Gaboriau was out in the field, but he would go and tell him. He soon appeared. He was an ill-looking little man, with a red beard and small, restless eyes. Although Emile Gaboriau professed to despise the nobility and the clergy, the hope of driving a good bargain made him obsequious to Louis. He insisted upon ushering his visitor into the parlor, with may bows and repetitions of M. the Marquis. Upon entering the room, he roughly ordered an old woman, who was crouching over some dying embers, to make haste and bring some wine for M. the Marquis of Clamarin. At this name, the old woman started as if she had received an electric shock. She opened her mouth to say something, but a look from her tyrant froze the words upon her lips. With a frightened air she hobbled out to obey his orders, and in a few minutes returned with a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. Then she resumed her seat by the fire, and kept her eyes fastened upon the Marquis. Could this really be the merry, pretty Mihan, who had been the confidant of the little fairy of Verberie? Valentine herself would never have recognized this poor, shriveled, emaciated old woman. Only those who are familiar with country life know what hard work and worry can do to make a woman old. The bargain, meanwhile, was being discussed between Joseph and Gaboriau, who offered a ridiculously small sum for the chateau, saying that he would only buy it to tear down, and sell the materials. Joseph enumerated the beams, joists, ashlars, and the ironwork, and volubly praised the old domain. As for Mihan, the presence of the Marquis had a wonderful effect upon her. If the faithful servant had hitherto never breathed the secret confided to her probity, it was none the less heavy for her to bear. After marrying, and being so harshly treated that she daily prayed for death to come to her relief, she began to blame everybody but herself for her misfortunes. Weakly superstitious, she traced back the origin of her sorrows to the day when she took the oath on the Holy Gospel during Mass. Her constant prayers that God would send her a child to soothe her wounded heart, being unanswered, she was convinced that she was cursed with barrenness for having assisted in the abandonment of an innocent, helpless babe. She often thought that by revealing everything, she could appease the wrath of heaven, and once more enjoy a happy home. Nothing but her love for Valentine gave her strength to resist a constant temptation to confess everything. But today the sight of Louis decided her to relieve her mind. She thought there could be no danger in confiding in Gaston's brother. Alas for woman's tongue! The sale was finally concluded. It was agreed that Fougerex should give 5,280 francs in cash for the chateau, and land attached, and Joseph was to have the old furniture. The Marquis and the new owner of the chateau shook hands, and noisily called out the essential word. Agreed. Fougerex went himself to get the bargain bottle of old wine. The occasion was favorable to Mihan. She walked quickly over to where the Marquis stood, and said in a nervous whisper, "Emma the Marquis, I must speak with you apart." "What can you want to tell me, my good woman?" "It is a secret of life and death. This evening, at dusk, meet me in the walnut wood, and I will tell you everything." Hearing her husband's approaching step, she darted back to her corner by the fire. Fougerex filled the glasses, and drank to the health of Clamaran. As they returned to the boat, Louis tried to think what could be the object of this singular rendezvous. "Joseph, what the deuce can that old witch want with me?" he said musingly. "Who can tell? She used to be in the service of a lady who was very intimate with M. Gaston, so my father used to say. If I were in your place I would go and see what she wanted, monsieur. You can dine with me, and, after dinner, Pillarel will row you over." Curiosity decided Louis to go, about 7 o'clock, to the walnut wood, where he found Mihan impatiently awaiting him. "Ah, here you are, at last, Emma the Marquis," she said, in a tone of relief. "I was afraid you would disappoint me." "Yes, here I am, my good woman, to listen to what you have to say." "I have many things to say. But first tell me some news of your brother." Louis regretted having come, supposing from this request that the old woman was childish, and might bother him for hours with her senseless gabble. "You know well enough that my poor brother was drowned in the Rhône." "Good heavens," cried Mihan, "are you ignorant, then, of his escape?" "Yes, he did what has never been done before, he swam across the swollen Rhône. The next day Emile Valentine went to Clamaran to tell the news, but Saint Jean prevented her from seeing you. Afterward I carried a letter from her, but you had left the country." Louis could not believe this strange revelation. "Are you not mixing up dreams with real events, my good woman?" he said banteringly. "No," she replied, mournfully shaking her head. "If Père Manuel were alive, he would tell you how he took charge of your brother until he embarked for Marseilles. But that is nothing compared to the rest. M. Gaston has a son." "My brother had a son. You certainly have lost your mind, my poor woman." "Alas, no. Unfortunately for my happiness in this world and in the world to come, I am only telling the truth. He had a child, and Emile Valentine was its mother. I took the poor babe, and carried it to a woman whom I paid to take charge of it. Then Nihan described the anger of the Countess, the journey to London, and the abandonment of little Raoul. With the accurate memory natural to people unable to read and write, she related the most minute particulars, the names of the village, the nurse, the child's Christian name, and the exact date of everything which had occurred. Then she told of Valentine's wretched suffering, of the impending ruin of the Countess, and finally how everything was happily settled by the poor girl's marriage with an immensely rich man, who was now one of the richest bankers in Paris, and was named Fauvel. A harsh voice calling, "Nihan?" "Nihan," here interrupted the old woman. "Heavens," she cried in a frightened tone, "that is my husband, looking for me." And, as fast as her trembling limbs could carry her, she hurried to the farmhouse. For several minutes after her departure, Louis stood rooted to the spot. Her recital had filled his wicked mind with an idea so infamous, so detestable, that even his vile nature shrank for a moment from its enormity. He knew Fauvel by reputation, and was calculating the advantages he might gain by the strange information of which he was now possessed by means of the old Nihan. It was a secret, which, if skillfully managed, would bring him in a handsome income. The few faint scruples he felt were silenced by the thought of an old age spent in poverty. After the price of the chateau was spent, to what could he look forward? Beggary. But first of all, he thought, I must ascertain the truth of the old woman's story, then I will decide upon a plan. This was why, the next day, after receiving the 5,280 francs from Fougeroux, Louis de Clameren set out for London.